YouTube, and welcome back to Semi-Stat Broadcasts. And today I'm going to be doing the third installment on my series on the regressive left, history, theory, and methodology. This being academic anarchy. By the late 1980s into early 90s, hate speech and harassment laws, powerful legal tools in the hands of regressives, were in the early stages of codification and already being used against critics and dissidents. The holy grail of the early academic SJWs was to be able to use hate speech and harassment laws to give legal force to the previously described ideological rationalizations for offense equaling oppression, and denial of guilt for oppression itself equating to oppression, due to the use of privileged voice to invisibilize the oppression of marginalized groups or some similar ideological rationalization. The results, as we've been seeing in recent months, would doubtlessly provoke the admiration of holy inquisitors and witch hunters down the ages, were it possible to resurrect them so that they could be alive today to see it. It is imperative, especially in this post-Me Too era, that harassment and hate speech laws not be crafted in this manner. Ideally, legislation crafted around hate speech and harassment laws should require proof of intent or malice, not rooted in ideological rationalizations, even if at a relatively low bar in a legal sense, requiring, say, substantial evidence or a preponderance of evidence as examples, before a person's career can be ruined or they can be held civilly liable under these laws. As we've been seeing, it is important that this be a high priority goal for an anti-regressive left movement. Women and other oppressed groups were, it was suggested, legitimate in engaging in behaviors that white males would be rightly condemned for. This included ideological gatekeeping, obtaining positions of influence and authority first on college campuses, then in positions of influence in the wider society that their academic credentials qualified them to access, and then using these positions to help or hinder the careers of others based on whether or not they toed the feminist party line or belonged to preferred, marginalized demographics. This has contributed to the dangerous trend towards growing ideological uniformity on college campuses and other professional areas of endeavor. When, in 2014, a backlash ensued against the encroachment of feminist and progressive ideology in video game criticism and design, the early Gamergate movement had no idea just how deep the rabbit hole they'd stumbled into went, and to this day its culturally libertarian successors continue to be shocked and blindsided by how pervasive cultural leftist influence over popular culture really is. It has been going on for decades now. Been told to check your privilege lately? Have you heard anything about how different forms of marginalization intersect with one another, creating multiple and layered forms of oppression? These bedrocks of present-day SJW theory were not invented with Tumblr and did not emerge in response to MRA neckbeards and gamergaters in the social media era. Privilege theory, as presently understood, dates back to a 1988 essay by feminist Peggy McIntosh, entitled, get ready for this, White Privilege and Male Privilege, a personal account of coming to see correspondences through work in women's studies. Though the concept of white privilege goes back much further, with white supremacy being described in 1935 by W.E.B. Du Bois as a psychological wage being offered to otherwise low-wage white workers. In 1989, a year after Peggy McIntosh's knapsack of privilege was first unpacked, another feminist theorist by the name of Kimberlé Williams Crenshaw proposed the concept of overlapping or intersecting social identities and related systems of oppression, domination, or discrimination. The whole basket of deplorables comes into play here: racism, misogyny, homophobia, discrimination surrounding sexual orientation, religion, and so on. Both Crenshaw's and McIntosh's theories, though looming large on social media these days, are not new and in their time built upon already a deeply established bedrock of theories. That certain demographics suffer from discrimination to greater degrees than others, and that intersecting combinations of marginalized identities compound the effects of such discrimination, are not objectionable observations in and of themselves, and there is nothing wrong with trying to narrow the gap in the life prospects of the marginalized vis-a-vis the privileged. These ideas become problematic when marginalized identities become weaponized in social contexts, and appeals to identity are used to buttress claims, usually implicit, of the comprehensive moral superiority of some groups over others. The term oppression Olympics has come into use to describe the petty and passive-aggressive forms of competitive victimhood that have become so rampant in SJW circles. Identity, who people are by accident of birth, was coming to overtake older notions of institutional power as explanatory factors for overall social inequality. Crenshaw and McIntosh's theories were a factor in this. Far more significantly, however, was the final discrediting of Marxism, though the move away from his theories even on the left was many decades old by then, that occurred with the dissolution of the USSR. The other great communist superpower, the People's Republic of China, was also experiencing success as a result of market reforms implemented during Deng Xiaoping's ascendancy over the Communist Party. Outside the communist world, social democracy was reeling under a worldwide shift to the right, typified by Reagan in America and Thatcher in the UK. The growing tide of corporate globalization, enabled by information technology and a more business-friendly political climate, allowed for global corporations to relocate production, usually to the aforementioned reformed China, and use capital flight and investment strike to curtail efforts at social democratic policymaking. Deindustrialization weakened the political clout of organized labor, who were then unable to resist the curtailing of union rights, especially in the United States and to varying degrees throughout the developed world. The effect that the rout of socialism in the 1980s had on the psyche of the political left during the 90s in the West can hardly be understated. The white male working class, now much less likely to be unionized and therefore more susceptible to supporting conservative governments on social issues, became a scapegoat for the ongoing political malaise suffered by a left increasingly dominated by a more professionalized, educated, and technocratic class. College degrees eclipsed union cards as the ticket to a middle-class life. Given the cultural climate on college campuses even then, this made non-discrimination a much more central priority than collective agreements, which had no place in the on-contract, just-in-time workplace emerging in the 1990s. The white working class, once the blue-collar, unionized standard-bearers of the New Deal liberals, were now despised for their racism, religiosity, and patriotism. Like the weakening of the religious right that would occur in the 2000s, the demise of socialism in the 1980s created an ideological vacuum that the ideas of Crenshaw and McIntosh would gradually come in to fill. The post-60s left came to share in their neoconservative cousins' disillusionment with Marxism, Lenin, Chairman Mao, the USSR, and even Third World revolutionaries. Closer to home, the unions and democratic socialist parties, themselves not immune to dogmatic and regressive tendencies, fell out of favor as the 70s wore on, and with some good reason. Picket line strife, ongoing disruptions of essential services due to strikes, and climates of us versus them militancy and groupthink led to disillusionment with organized labor and its political wings. Sprawling government bureaucracy and bloated union contracts were widely blamed for the stagflation crisis of the late 1970s, which helped usher in a climate of free market dominance in economic theory that would remain almost wholly unchallenged until the Lehman Brothers meltdown 30 years later. Disillusionment that both the neoconservative right, unions cause unemployment and inflation, and the postmodern left, unions are white male dominated, were able to exploit. But the process of shifting from economic to cultural priorities on the left was already decades old. The theorists of the Frankfurt School, which had begun in 1920s Germany, found a more fertile ground in post-World War II academia. By the time of the emergence of the Students for a Democratic Society on UC Berkeley in the early 1960s, Frankfurt School theories were themselves already decades old. The Frankfurt School is best known for its concept of critical theory, a school of revolutionary thought that borrowed as much from Sigmund Freud as it did from Karl Marx. It used some elements of psychoanalytic theory to suggest that the degree of control exerted by culture and prevalent ideologies exerted over the people was far deeper and far more pernicious than traditional Marxism, with its emphasis on economic relations, had originally thought possible. Better-known Frankfurt theorists include Herbert Marcuse, Theodor Adorno, and Max Horkheimer, among others. The doctrines of critical theory were complex, but tended to revolve around criticism of authoritarian and hierarchical norms in fundamental social institutions and relationships, such as the family, religion, patriotic sentiment, and so on. Parallel to critical theory, and just as important in the development of present-day regressive thought, is the emergence of postmodern and post-structuralist philosophy. Like critical theory, postmodernism, so-called, has roots going back to the early 20th century, but does not emerge into prominence until after the Second World War. Associated with philosophers such as Jean Baudrillard, Michel Foucault, and Jacques Derrida, postmodernism is not an easy concept to pin down. Postmodern scholarship is notoriously abstract, impenetrable, and jargon-laden. Wikipedia defines it as being defined by an attitude of skepticism or distrust towards grand narratives, ideologies, and various tenets of Enlightenment rationality, including the existence of objective reality and absolute truth, as well as notions of rationality, human nature, and progress. Instead, it asserts that knowledge and truth are the product of unique systems of social, historical, or political discourse and interpretation, and are therefore contextual and constructed to varying degrees. Accordingly, postmodern thought is broadly characterized by tendencies to epistemological and moral relativism, pluralism, self-referentiality, and irony. In short, extreme cultural relativism. And this relativism doesn't just apply to morality, but to the very foundations of philosophy itself. Metaphysics, the nature of reality, and epistemology, basic theory surrounding man's means of acquiring knowledge, were assumed to be socially constructed, and therefore likely to vary by culture according to each culture's own unique history and characteristics. There is something to be said for this. Human thought processes do not take place in a vacuum. It is rational to assume that our upbringings and cultures will have a significant impact on our own value systems, means of perceiving the world, and even the subconscious processes by which we intake and process information. The awareness of this and propensity to question our own assumptions, to Deconstruct, in post-structuralist jargon, is a mark of philosophical and moral depth. It is worth being aware, however, of the potential for cultural relativism to lend itself to nihilism, or even a propensity to rationalize genuinely barbaric and harmful aspects of other cultures. If taken to its natural and logical conclusions, its deconstruction of Western liberal principles as being the byproducts of Western and thereby racist and misogynist culture opens the door to enabling decidedly illiberal ideas. If all cultures are equal and there's no such thing as any kind of objective morality, on what grounds can postmodern feminists, for example, assume that egalitarian cultures are in any way superior to patriarchal or racist cultures, especially since racial and gender equality are decidedly Western liberal notions? Naturally, of course, postmodern academia does not tend to entertain such questions. Regressive leftism seems to cherry-pick postmodernism to enable the deconstruction of the Western canon they so despise, but exempt their own unstated moral and philosophical presumptions from similar analysis. And we will discuss postmodernist and similar kinds of philosophy in the next installment, aptly called Postmodern Pandemonium. These have been Simi's Broadcasts, and I'm looking forward to seeing you next time. Over and out.